Hello, and welcome to the IPA Annual Convention Program 6. Untreated mental health trauma creates bias in the child welfare system. If you are not satisfied with the sound from your computer speakers, call in and listen on the telephone using the dial-in instructions we sent you previously. You can switch to telephone audio at any time. Live interactive Q&A will take place at the midway point, or at the end of this session. Please submit questions by typing your question into the Q&A box at the right side of the screen and press Enter. If you have a technical issue, please click on the Tech tab also on the right side of your screen, or call tech support at 877-297-2901. To verify your attendance, please respond to the attendance prompts that will appear on your screen by clicking Confirm. Do not type in Yes. I am pleased to introduce the IPA Program Chair and today's moderator, Dr. Kalyani Gopal. When you are ready, please begin.
Good evening, everyone. I'm really excited to be here with my very, very dear friend, Dr. Jane Conran, who's on the faculty of Northwestern University. Many of us know her as a very vibrant and very involved individual in community activities. Since arriving in Chicago in 1984, Jane has been involved in working with impoverished communities in Chicago, especially with the child and family welfare system. Welcome, Jane. I'm looking forward to your presentation, as the rest of us are.
Thank you so much, Kalyani. I'm very glad to be here. This talk is on a topic that is near and dear to my heart. Wanting to see addressed since the early years when I arrived in Chicago. So without further ado, I do want to tell people that this is going to be a very dense program. It includes a lot of different concepts that are being woven together, and there is a bibliography available to them, which is 8 pages that they do have access to through Beacon. They will make that available to you. Without further ado, we are going to start the program.
Hello, and welcome to the Doc Exchange, a Real Stories podcast
in partnership with the Grierson Trust.
Every week, I'll ask a new filmmaker or filmmaking team about 3 documentaries connected by a single theme that have made a meaningful impression on their work and life.
One more. 3, 2, 1. Immediately afterwards, a heavy dust. 3, 2, 1. Immediately afterwards, a heavy and dark cloud of ash started spreading toward the lake.
It's been over 20 years since Chicago began to rewrite a chapter of its own story. A story tucked away in the shadows of its famous skyline. Closing an era shrouded in an ambiguous past. One that, if not remembered, will soon be forgotten. This story's legacy, the violence and poverty that plague Chicago's hyper-segregated communities. But what is known about the systems that created them? The laws that isolated them? And the policies that abandoned them? And how does a city heal from decades of heartbreak and loss? At the crossroad of a nation, this is Chicago's story.
3, 2, 1.
Whoa!
72 murders for the month.
3 days, 68 people were shot.
What the hell is going on in Chicago?
That's more people shot in one weekend than wounded in a typical month in battle-torn Iraq.
17305 South Polina, shots fired at the police, male black jacket.
Putting Chicago on pace for 700.
A man was shot live on Facebook last night.
Deadly gun violence is surging in Chicago once again.
After a horrific weekend in Chicago,
more needs to be done.
More than 3,000 people have been shot in Chicago.
Homicide is related to the desperation of young men, and particularly black young men in the United States. And that's what we're seeing in Chicago.
When people think of PTSD as being what happens to people who've been in combat,
the choices are very limited. What I got to lose? My life?
You break down a city, it's like a tale of two cities. If you are downtown Chicago, you almost feel untouchable. Then you go south.
You go out to some of the neighborhoods, they just are starved for resources and investment.
That's abandonment. That's just systematic destruction.
It's that pot that's boiling, the stuff can start spilling out, or we could turn the fire down.
You hear people, they present the problem, and they say, yo, this is the problem, this is the problem, this is the problem. Okay, you're woke, you know the problem. What is the solution?
Hello.
That is the beginning of our presentation about the problems of disinvestment in the parts of the city that are primarily the Black population in Chicago, and the increase in poverty and the increase in child welfare reports. We're going to start by talking about when a city perpetually neglects a segment of the population by neglecting the neighborhood's well-being, how are the residents impacted? How does this impact residents' mental, physical, and psychological functioning? Is the increased depression, anxiety, substance abuse, vulnerability to trauma and violence, and lack of role models or community support easy to overlook? Poverty increases child welfare reports, especially in Black neighborhoods. This is part of a policy study paper put out by the University of Chicago, Chapin Hall, in 2021. Black residents are disproportionately impacted by stress in their neighborhoods. Does growing up in a disenfranchised environment lead to mental health issues? What are the mental health issues? Would these be considered to fall under a diagnosable category that needs addressing by the American for Disabilities Act? Should the circumstances of poverty, disenfranchisement, and inequitable investment by the city of Chicago be considered cause for legal action? I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the research that's been done recently and the policy paper that was done by Chapin Hall. I'm going to read directly from this policy paper that was produced in July of this year. Economic hardship in child maltreatment. Families below the poverty line are 3 times more likely to be substantiated for child maltreatment. Economic disparities and historical systemic disadvantages have fueled disproportionate child welfare system involvement among families of color. Evidence about the root causes of child maltreatment has been well documented, including poverty-related risk factors such as unemployment, single parenthood, housing instability, earlier childbearing, and the lack of child care. Hang on just a second. It's my first time doing a presentation online, so I'm a little bit. We're going to talk now about what happens when you engage in child reports at a disproportional rate in families and communities, and how you're impacting those families. This is a paper by Dorothy Roberts. She's the Kirkland and Ellis Professor, Northwestern University School of Law, and Faculty Fellow for the Institute for Policy Research in Chicago, Illinois. Racial disproportionality is now recognized by many researchers and government officials as a critical issue in child welfare policy and practice. An understudied aspect of racial disproportionality, however, is its community impact. Many poor African American neighborhoods have very high rates of child welfare agency involvement, especially placement of children in foster care. Researchers have yet to investigate the socio-political impact of this spatial concentration of child welfare supervision, the system's quote-unquote racial geography. By conducting and analyzing in-depth interviews of 25 residents of an African American neighborhood in Chicago, this study aimed to better understand how intense child welfare agency involvement affects community and civic life. From her paper, the residents were all aware of intense child welfare agency involvement in their neighborhood and identified profound effects on family and community social relationships, including interference with parental authority, damage to children's ability to form social relationships, and distrust amongst neighbors. The study also discovered attention. What's that? The study also. I'm getting some feedback. Are you hearing that, Kalyani? Are you hearing the feedback?
I heard it just a bit. I'll make a note of it, but you can go on.
Okay. The study also discovered a tension between respondents' identification of adverse consequences of concentrated state supervision for family and community relationships and neighborhood reliance on agency involvement for needed financial support. So, one of the questions that I had when I started to look into my concerns about the disproportionality of Black children being separated from their parents at a rate that was essentially 3 times that of white parents in the city of Chicago and the county of Cook County, was what could possibly be going on in this conundrum that wouldn't have been addressed by the state and the city already? And what could be contributing to this problem? How could this actually be happening with people unaware of the impact that this must be happening on these families in these communities. Because when you separate a child from his or her parents, so many adverse things are potential results. And those adverse things that happen include children that become anxious, children that become fearful, children that become guarded, children that become mistrustful, and families that stop being able to see themselves as having a support system and being capable of being in a role that was their natural biological right. It's a very startling picture when you look at what has actually taken place. So my question was, well, what is the variable? What are the issues involved in this? Why is it in this community, in this racial population, that the city of Chicago is taking children into foster care and making DCFS reports? And what I discovered was that poverty is a major factor in the disproportionate child welfare reports for people in Black communities. And this is 70% of child welfare reports. They're reports of neglect. I'm sorry, I conflated that. What I wanted to say was 70% of child welfare reports are based on neglect, and a high proportion of reports of people that have been reported for neglect having in high incidence of poverty. So my question was, would separations go down and child functioning go up if there were more investment in the neglected neighborhoods of the city that are primarily where Black residents live? As I said, of child maltreatment reports, a vast majority, according to the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services from 2010, 71% of victims being reported are reported for neglect. Recently, increased attention has been paid to how different aspects of poverty may differentially impact certain subpopulations of children. For example, although Black families experience poverty about 3 times as often as white families, they are about 12 times more likely to live in areas of concentrated poverty. Recent child maltreatment research has highlighted the very different context of poverty for Black and white children. Neglect is the most common form of maltreatment and strongly associated with poverty. Black children reported to child welfare reside in far poorer communities than whites, even after taking into account family income. Black children were more commonly reported and substantiated for severe and basic needs neglect. Community poverty indicators had a different relationship to report disposition for Black as compared to white children after controlling for neglect subtypes, child and family characteristics. The use of individual poverty measures without corresponding community poverty measures is likely to systematically understate the poverty-related problems of poverty faced by Black children, particularly those related to the community, such as resource availability and the presence of high levels of social disorganization. Now, we are going to look at this year's DCFS reports through September 30th, 2021 in the county of Cook. And I want to give people a little bit of information about, In Cook County, the racial makeup of the county is 56% white and 26% black. In the statistics for the DCFS reports this year in Cook County, of the total of 6,295, 70% are Black African American reports. 28% are white. What's wrong with this picture? Well, as I was working through the details to try and sort of understand the research that's been done on poverty and child welfare reports for neglect, poverty and impact on mental health, poverty and stressors on parenting, poverty and neurobiology impacts on the brain, poverty and intergenerational health issues of severe consequences in physical health. I then decided to go through the data that exists again with DCFS and also the United States zip code, because I wanted to look at what poverty looked like and foster care looked like along the different zip codes of Chicago. So DCFS does a nice job of identifying how many reports they have in the city, in the different zip codes, and the state has this information as well. It's very long. We have a lot of zip codes. One of the things that I noticed that was so substantial was that a lot of numbers were really low, as you'll see in these first zip codes. For some reason, I can't see an enlarged picture here, so I'm just using my my information. Can't see it very clearly, but the numbers are in the single digits or the teens or the low 20s until you get to certain zip codes. And then suddenly the numbers become 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 times as high. So I was stunned as to what that might mean. Why does one zip code that has a similar population to another zip code have such a different rate right through October of this year? And so I started to take a look using the zip codes and putting them into the US Post Office, which does by zip code tell you how many people are employed, how many people live there, what the general income is in these areas. And here's some of my work. It is breaking down all of those above 60. And that was an arbitrary number that I came up with. I just decided 60 seemed like a lot of kids to be removed this year or to have reports on them this year in any given zip code. It's something that looked like it would be a reasonable number. What happened was I started to find that if I looked up what the neighborhood is, that it was broken down by race, and it was in fact disproportionately Black for all of those that exceeded 100 and above. It was disheartening, to say the least, because this was right through October 31st, 2021. So these numbers represent little people. Each number represents a child, and each child is involved in a family that has had disruption. And if we take a look at the intergenerational transmission of what happens when you become involved in family systems, and you look at what happens when families are broken up and parents and children are separated, there is then a very significant likelihood that those children will then have difficulties parenting and being successful having families of their own. I'm going to read off from some of the research that's been done about parenting and separation and adverse childhood experiences. And the first research, hang on, sorry, I just lost the studio. Okay. The first research project I'm going to talk about is one by Howard and Miriam Steele. It was published in 2016 in the Canadian Journal of Behavioral Science. It's entitled Adverse Childhood Experiences, Poverty, and Parenting Stress. I'm going to read from the abstract. Adverse childhood experiences are associated with physical and mental health problems in adulthood, as well as unresolved or discordant states of mind regarding attachments that have implications for problematic parenting. Currently, there are no studies on the associations between ACEs and adults' subjective experience of stress in the parenting role, where socioeconomic status related poverty effects have been controlled for. This is the central question behind the current study. We examined exposure to ACEs among 118 mothers, N of 33 with low SES impoverished, and N of 85 middle high SES, and parenting distress. Parents completed an ACE questionnaire that assessed exposure to 10 adverse experiences from childhood. They included abuse, neglect, and household dysfunction, and the Parenting Stress Index short form. Parenting distress and ACEs were significantly higher in the low SES group. Yet even after controlling for SES, higher ACE scores added significantly explained variance in parental distress in a linear regression model. Discussion focuses on the need to administer ACE screening in prenatal and pediatric settings to identify and to offer trauma and attachment-informed treatment so to reduce the intergenerational transmission of risk associated with problematic parenting. I'm going to read a second review, and this is from 2017 by Lomanowski, Bovin, Hertzman, and Fleming. Parenting Begets Parenting, a neurobiological perspective on early adversity and the generational transmission of parenting styles. The developing brains of young children are highly sensitive to input from their social environment. Nurturing social experiences during this time promotes the acquisition of social and cognitive skills and emotional competencies. However, many young children are confronted with obstacles to healthy development, including poverty, inappropriate care, and violence. And their enhanced sensitivity to the social environmental means that are highly susceptible to these adverse childhood experiences. One source of social adversity in early life can stem from parenting that is harsh, inconsistent, non-sensitive, or hostile. Parenting is considered to be the cornerstone of early socioeconomic development, and an adverse parenting style is associated with adjustment problems and a higher risk of developing mood and behavior disorders. Importantly, there is a growing literature showing that an important predictor of parenting behavior is how parents, especially mothers, were parented themselves. Okay. Sorry, wait a minute.
John Bowlby was a British psychologist, and he became extremely interested in child-mother separation during the bombing of London. The bombing of London, a lot of parents sent their kids to the safety of the countryside. And the kids were with safe people. They were well cared for. They were well fed. But they still had a very negative response to the separation from their mothers. At that point, he looked at the biology that was emerging in primatology. A monkey infant gets almost all its nutrition in the first 2 or 3 months of life from its mother, from lactation. But the infant who's weaned still seeks proximity. You'll see the infant reach out and touch the mom's tail or touch its coat. There's a continuing lifelong desire for proximity and contact. And Bowlby and others have seen that proximity seeking and that contact seeking as being cornerstones of what they call attachment behavior.
In the first part of the 20th century, behaviorists and psychoanalysts claimed that babies love their parents because you don't want to bite the hand that feeds you. The innovation of Bowlby was to observe that that can't be all, that what the child needs is not only to be fed, but also to be held by an understanding, sensitive, and responsive adult, and that optimal social and mental health outcomes will follow from that. And 60 or more years on now, we have a half century of evidence showing that he was more or less right.
Our program at the Center for Babies, Toddlers, and Families is really based on the theories of John Bowlby, with the idea that we really need to help parents and children form a secure attachment. So oftentimes, families are referred to us when the parents have had very difficult childhoods themselves and are really struggling in this role of being a parent.
Like I said, I never had a mommy. I was never taught how to take care of anybody or myself, so it was like very hard. Like I wouldn't have patience, like the crying, like I would, scream at her and stuff like that, And
for many parents who really were neglected as children, hearing a baby cry triggers in them their own feelings of that unrelenting crying that they did. So for Pearl, it was very, very difficult for her to be able to meet her child's needs.
Push it, push this button. Yeah, hard, push it.
We've partnered with the Center for Attachment Research at the new school for a series of attachment measures to test that our intervention is effective.
So come on in, Pearl. That's going to be your chair. So just put her down and let her have a go at whatever she wants to do in here. Okay? We measure the attachment relationship with a laboratory scenario that takes 20 minutes. The critical point is where the mother gets a cue to leave the room.
Bye, baby girl. sit lay down.
Some children look on the outside like they're very independent and seem not to notice, but physiologically are very aroused and stay aroused even in the presence of when that caregiver returns. By contrast, the securely attached child often notices, cries when the caregiver leaves, and when the caregiver comes back, easily turns to the caregiver and looks to the caregiver to be comforted, and then they can get back to some kind of homeostasis.
Okay, you play with them.
We think this response is one of the hallmarks of mental health.
No.
What is so interesting about childhood development is that we know a lot about the long-term, lifelong consequences of early life adversity, ranging from psychological effects like substance abuse and depression, but also biological consequences like increased incidence of cardiovascular disease, diabetes, and a whole host of other physical ailments. One of the things we know that can lead down the path towards cardiovascular disease is chronic inflammation. Inflammation is a biological response that helps the body counteract an infection. The body produces chemicals which activate the immune system and allow it to get rid of the infective agent. When the infection is contained, the body calls forth cortisol to try to turn down the inflammation. Now, this is all good, but there are situations, especially connected with traumatic experiences, in which that cortisol response doesn't happen. So these people who had these adverse early life experiences had elevated levels of inflammation, which is at the heart of cardiovascular disease. So cortisol is very important.
Okay. That's my boy.
The way that we measure cortisol is through a saliva sample obtained upon arrival at the lab and at the end of the lab visit. And our goal is to, over time, impact patterns of cortisol.
Is that okay?
At our initial measurements of these families when they were beginning the intervention, we see very low levels of attachment security as measured by their behavior. But when we look at families who have participated for 6 months or more, we see attachment security at 70%, the same level seen worldwide.
There you go.
Because higher levels of attachment security correlate with more normal cortisol responses. We're hoping to see their cortisol levels change as a result of the intervention.
You laughing at mommy? Huh? You laughing at mommy? The main thing was it helped me a lot to focus on my child. You know, like before I couldn't tolerate the crying and it would make me crazy and I used to be depressed. But now, I mean, sometimes I can't take it, but you know, I know better now.
What have we learned from the studies of early life adversity? What we've learned is to take it seriously, that these are real biological issues. That early attachment is vital to everything else that happens. Something that is an inevitable part of who we are as human beings.
So what we've learned is adverse childhood experiences in early childhood, and this is from a study that's who it's from is cut off, but Johnson and et al. In, I believe, 2019. Adverse childhood experiences in early childhood and development outcomes during the middle childhood and adolescent years. They've been understudied among low-income Black families, and they did a study to test a model linking economic hardship, single mothers' parenting stress, ACEs, and non-resident fathers' involvement in early childhood to behavior problems in middle childhood and adolescence. The participants in setting were that they used 6 waves of longitudinal data from a subsample of 800 unmarried Black mothers, non-resident fathers, and their children at childbirth ages 1, 3, 5, 9, and 15 from the Fragile Families and Child Well-Being Study, a nationally representative data set. The results were mothers' economic hardship was associated directly with parenting stress and related both directly and indirectly through parenting stress to the children's increased likelihood of exposure to ACEs. This is cut off, but non-resident fathers' involvement was associated with a reduction in parenting stress and a reduction in ACE exposure for children.
Hello.
So how does the transmission of stress from parent to child impact the developing child, the child's functioning and performance in their important areas of functioning, including school, relationships, behavior, and future employment? This data is substantial, and adolescents are suffering significantly, as are young children, with school dropout rates at 8th grade and high school, early high school, not reaching the reading or math or education levels of their white counterparts, and having difficulties in areas of concentration, attention, focus, and the ability to basically function in school. Poor outcomes come as a trickle-down effect from difficulties with lack of resources, increased stress with parents, and then increased tension and increased use of distractions and other activities to avoid some of the internal distress that parents often feel. So we see higher rates of substance abuse, higher rates of unavailability, depression, anxiety, and other issues in these mothers and fathers, making their ability to focus and be involved as parents much more challenged. Sorry, my slide's not moving forward. I don't know why.
Hello, and welcome to the Doc Exchange, a Real Stories podcast, in partnership with the Grierson Trust. Every week, I'll ask a new filmmaker or filmmaking team about 3 documentaries connected by a single theme that have made a meaningful impression on their work and life.
We're moving this slide forward, guys, so hang on just a second. Moving the video forward.
Shot while playing outside on this hot summer day.
When I turn her head, it's just leaking blood. I just really want us to live in peace.
Sometimes the only way people can cope is just to try not to cope, not even to deal with it, ignore it like it's not happening because it becomes too much. And people are afraid. When a 6-year-old girl from my school says to me, Father Mike, will you pray for me? I said, what am I going to pray for? She said, that I'm alive at the end of the summer. That a child has to even think like that at 6, they deserve their future. They have a right to grow up.
growing back. You got a little afro right there.
What do you want to be when you grow up?
A doctor and police.
Oh, so she's gonna have 2 jobs. She's gonna be a police officer and a doctor, huh?
Yep.
You're gonna be making people feel good and taking the crime off the streets at the same time. That's what I'm talking about, my baby. What's our phrase? What you want people to do? What you want these men to do outside?
Put the guns down. Put the guns down.
We gonna fight, shoot, and kill over blocks that have been abandoned and neglected. Some blocks that look like third world countries, and we're gonna fight over a block that other people don't give a damn about. How stupid is that? Instead of banding together and saying, we're gonna be in the real fight and bring some economic development, bring some jobs, bring some hope, bring some possibility back to our community. You can't just say
Okay. So,
Hello, and welcome.
Sorry. There's a whenever you touch the video, it starts up again. So I apologize for that. So, what I want to talk about now is this confluence of tragic variables and circumstances and the role that actually urban planning and the development of the city of Chicago's racial policies have had to do with what is going on in Black families and how this urban policy and planning that goes back early to 1942 and meant to impose segregation on the Black people that moved up from the South to look for better opportunity in Chicago, and how a policy put in effect by businesses, banks, and the government in the city was designed specifically to only allow Blacks to live in certain neighborhoods. I want to talk a little bit about this because in the situation that exists now, where families have this tremendous deleterious impact on their lives, on their ability to function properly, on their social disorganization, on the stress that they're going through, and on the intergenerational trauma that they experience, this didn't happen naturally. This didn't happen because people were ineffective by nature. It happened because the city established a set of policies that put people in an untenable, racially segregated, overpopulated segment of the city starting in 1942. And these policies of the city are well documented, but not discussed and not looked at for the responsibility that they hold for how families are now suffering in areas such as the disproportionate experience of poverty and the disproportionate experience of living in unresourced, broken down communities and having their children investigated and put in foster care at rates that are frankly abominable. So I want to talk a little bit about this, and I'm going to talk about it from a public policy standpoint. I have a political science background and an interest in policy since I was quite young in college. And I have paid attention to the issues of the segregation in the city of Chicago since I arrived in Chicago in 1984. In 1984, when I arrived, I came from my undergraduate program and then had worked for a couple years in Colorado. And I was told by people, you know what, there are certain parts of the city you shouldn't go to. And I found that to be an astounding thing to hear. And I was immediately concerned that some group must be in a part of the city that somehow seems as though it would be unsafe for me to go in, socialize, interact with, or join that group. So when I arrived, I actually did go down to the areas that I was told that I shouldn't go down to. And what I saw was astounding. There were no businesses. There were no stores other than liquor stores. There were no businesses. There were churches, and there were no trees, and there were no homes that weren't surrounded by broken glass, broken sidewalks, and occasionally the man walking around that looked disheveled, had a paper bag with a bottle in it and black hole for eyes. In 1989, when I started my internship in Hyde Park, I took the Cottage Grove number 4 bus to my internship after my car broke down, and I saw children getting on the bus in front of the projects, and they looked scared at 7:30 in the morning, holding each other's hands. I saw people having very, very little. And this was an experience that I assumed with the city having the Chicago Bears the next year. I mean, in 1985, the Chicago Bears won the Super Bowl. The Bulls were all about winning championship after championship, that the city was certainly going to address this inequity because the city was wealthy and resources existed. It didn't happen. It hasn't happened. Segregation is as substantial now as it was when it was forced segregation in 1942. But how it developed was that people were put into environments where they basically were under-resourced and not allowed to live elsewhere. And then those environments were torn down, and the city then went to public housing. And throughout the South Side, built 26 public housing neighborhoods that housed over 26,000 people that were under-resourced and did nothing to provide those individuals economic opportunities. Businesses left, and people had poor education and very underinvestment from the city of Chicago. So at this point in my career, having done the work that I've done for over 30 years, I have seen the terrible destruction of families in the foster care system because families continue to not know how to stay connected because they don't have the support like the woman that we just saw in the attachment study, where they're not getting any sort of individual care or institutional support. The opposite has actually happened. Cabrini Green and the rest of the projects were blown up, and people were not prepared and people were left without resources and given vouchers for Section 8 housing, which was the next new best thing. But Section 8 housing put people in the same circumstances they were in before, where people that were under-resourced went to communities that were under-resourced, and the communities that were under-resourced offered nothing to the people that were under-resourced. Then we had the last couple of mayoral administrations. And at that point, there was a supposed goal, and this is something that started under our Mayor Daley, and it was to correct blighted environments and to give blighted environments opportunities. And it was something I won't get into because we don't have a lot of time for me to do that, but it's called a TIF, a tax increment financing district. And basically, the long of the short of it was that tax increment financing district has become a coffer, which now has almost $1 billion in it this year. Every year it exceeds well over 500 million of people's tax dollars, that has been supposed to go to blighted neighborhoods since 1986, and instead has funded things like Fulton Market, the DePaul Sports Complex, all sorts of developer goals for new buildings and structures, and there is absolutely no oversight to it. And this process has been another one in the unfair, disenfranchised communities sort of nail in the coffin, where we are not providing anything to undercut the destruction that has been done to families of color by the urban planning system by the city. So how does this all get addressed? What do we do? What can we do? What should we do? How do we do anything if nobody's doing something about it? Well, in my experience in other areas that I'm involved in policy or in community outside of psychology, one of the things that I've learned and been taught is if there's a law on the books, use it. If there's a way to show that something is unfair, find a way to enforce it. And so in the area of mental health, we now have enough evidence to show that people that are living in poverty, to the degree that Black communities have been forced into since 1942, when this urban planning started, that was forced segregation, and that creates mental health issues, then anything that's done to a community that is against a federal law, such as creating trauma, depression, anxiety, or stress, can be used to enforce fair and equitable treatment under the law. And in this case, the Department of Children and Family Services is in fact required to address clients as well as anybody that works there, employing and following the letter of the law for the American with Disabilities Act. And it's my belief that if there is to be an action that child welfare advocates, public policy people such as Chapin Hall at the University of Chicago, and many others in the state of Illinois, that one of the things that needs to happen is we need to look at how to stop the implementation of child welfare reports and separation in these areas that are enforced poverty, that create mental health issues, and that perpetuate the intergenerational transmission of trauma, depression, and parenting issues. So this is a complicated issue. It's a big concern, but this has been going on and people are obviously dying and families are fragmented, and this process needs to be approached from a different angle other than leaving it up to the politicians and the people that provide or receive money from the politicians. And I think there are a lot of great politicians, but I haven't seen anything great happen since I arrived in Chicago in 1984. It's only gotten worse. But now it's trickled down to the degree that families are being impacted, and psychologists, like people such as those that work in hospitals, those that work in community mental health centers, those that work in foster care, we all see the impact. So that is my talk. I want to leave it now to discussion or questions. Maybe Kalyani and I are going to talk now, and maybe if any audience members have anything to say about it, I'd welcome any thoughts. But that's basically the presentation. Kalyani, I'll leave it to you now.
Thank you, Jane. I had to unmute my mic. But thank you for this wonderful and very insightful presentation. It has been quite an eye-opener, and I'm in the field, so it's wonderful to hear someone who, it's sometimes like speaking to the choir, right? But it's such a wonderful thing because a lot of younger generation of psychologists do not necessarily work in the field of foster care. So having them involved in topics such as attachment, because all of us see patients with children or, are about to be parents. So the issue of parenting and attachment is very, very important. I'd like to move to Adina's question. How do we get this data in front of Congress to push for increased investment in intervention for these neighborhoods? Would you like to answer that?
Sure. If yes, Adina, I would say that is the most important question, which is we create our own task force. And in that creation, we start to lobby other people to sign on to the kind of task force that will then lobby our representatives to sit down and have a discussion about policy. And we have to outline things that we believe are steps that will actually make differences. And we have to have our facts and our data with us to show how these differences can be implemented on the street level. I do believe that there are plenty of people, such as those at Chapin Hall, that have enormous thoughts about what can be done and that would be willing to become part of a task force that then lobbies with our representatives. This is obviously a crisis. And I think any intervention by a mental health expert that includes a group of mental health experts will make a difference.
I think that's absolutely true. And in addition to what Jane said, Adina and others, the ACE questionnaire has been implemented in legislative efforts. It's actually gone through legislation, been approved in legislation in 23 states in the United States. And we're pushing for it to be approved in other states as well. What's interesting is Medicaid is actually reimbursing at $29 extra for those physicians in those states to actually administer the ACE questionnaire so that they can correlate and ask questions about early childhood that have impacted, say for example, obesity or hypertension, all the issues that Jane was talking about, very high correlation. And so that's something that's ongoing. And we actually, as psychologists, are planning to push for legislation with Congress as we move forward. So thank you for that question. The next question, Jane, is Adina says, contrary to what is supposed to happen, people with Section 8 vouchers can, in practice, only get apartments in certain areas, usually the poorer neighborhoods. How does that affect their futures?
Well, I would say that that is the consequence of very poor planning when the projects came down, and that it is just another displacement and another segregation of a population that is being put in areas where there isn't an opportunity to move up and to integrate into communities where they can make their own resources to the degree that would establish them with higher levels of self-esteem, a sense of purpose, and also a sense that they have a community that is theirs to be part of. And in this, I just have to say, when the city took down some of these projects, the suspicion, which turned out to be true, was that they were sitting on very, very valuable land. Cabrini Green's land was worth over $1 billion. What was built in replacement was supposed to be middle income and lower income housing, but it was townhomes to the tune of $900,000. This has happened all over the city. So the idea that there was a plan that was going to change the trajectory of people leaving the projects they were forced into, basically, was not true. There was no plan. This, again, I'm just obviously have a lot of feelings about this, but this is the very cynical look at, if people don't have resources, they tend to vote less, they tend to impact a politician's future less, and so they're ignored for the people that have resources, and the politicians attempt to provide to the people that have resources. It's a very, very bad cycle.
It's a disturbing cycle, absolutely.
Yeah.
You know, one of the things you said was in certain zip codes, I love that slide where you had the post-it notes with the different zip codes. And the zip code 60644 had 183 cases versus some others had about 10 or 15. So given a D minus grade, I looked it up, I Googled it while you were talking. So I looked it up, it had a D minus grade for crime, which means the crime was much higher there as compared to other areas. And if you look at that susceptibility, right, the combination of poverty, lack of education, housing insecurity, food insecurity, economic insecurity, single parenting, domestic violence, human trafficking, you name it. You have all those high risk factors within that. And yet, some individuals come out more resilient, optimistic. So there's a positive aspect with the protective factors with how they've responded to trauma. So it'd be interesting to find out, especially with that one qualitative study you mentioned about stress, parenting stress, and how parents who are not parented adequately had higher levels of parenting stress and how they measured that. That's very, very interesting. So how do we then, given some of the suggestions you had and solutions you presented about the lab, the parenting lab, how do we, as psychologists, how do we present that so that legislators at this point have all this rich data that you presented? And the next step for us would be to say, here's the data. This is what it shows. You can save X number of dollars if you invest this much money into this population. It's all come down, unfortunately, to economics, right? The dollars. So how much does it cost? So I think one of the critical aspects of your presentation is presenting the scientific data and research, and then having that move forward through legislation to provide those specific components of prevention, so to speak, so that these young people do not grow up at a higher level of risk for criminality and exposure to becoming victims of crime. What are your thoughts on that?
No, I agree with you completely. This is the data is essential, and the clinical case presentations that have solid data is also essential. So if you don't mind, I'd like to just speak to that for a minute. Is that okay?
Absolutely. Go ahead.
So in I think it was 1993, a terrible tragedy happened with a woman who had terrible experiences in foster care and sexually molested, much abuse, and she became a mother. And she had many serious mental health problems. She had tried to, eat glass. She had been in the hospital many times. She had tried to kill herself many times. And she had a couple of children, and one of the children was returned to her, and she ended up killing that child within 2 months. And a psychotic process. The state at that point created a task force of clinicians that had experience in the field to work with the child welfare department here, DCFS, and to work with parents that were at high risk because they had poverty and mental health and obviously many ACE indicators, and follow them through the courts. And in the process, many of those individuals ended up being quite successful parents and also ended up employed off of substances out of the hospital with children that ended up with them on honor rolls. I happen to be one of those people. I treated 5 families, and 4 of them ended up being very successful. 4 of the 5 families were African American. And this experience shows that there is a benefit clinically as well as economically, because those families were not needing aid and they were not needing any sort of intervention that then also costs the state money. The state has to be involved with parents and families on multiple levels when they've made a child report and then put a child in foster care. The state is paying the foster parents. It's something that there's a
It
lot of
is.
evidence, a lot of data, there's human data. And one of the things that I experienced, because, you had to go to court a whole lot over many years, and sometimes there was an intent to separate no matter how well you had done. And so you had to have a back and forth with the legal people saying, I'm not going to let you separate these parents from these children. They're doing well. And you had to tell people the human story. And my experience was the judges would then say, I want to hear from her. All right, you lawyers, stop. I want to hear from her. Why? Because you had the human story. You had the relationship story and you knew the
Absolutely.
impact. So you have to combine the human story with the economic story, with the number story, and you'll find that people do actually have compassion, but you have to get in front of them and they have to feel like there's a reason. And in certainly inner cities, Detroit, Chicago, a lot of these cities, it is very, very crisis oriented. So I think there's an opportunity to do something
Absolutely.
just for that alone. Yeah.
I think it's a great point and excellent points, all of them. So that's one of the reasons when I opened up the shelter, about Ashley's house. I don't call it a shelter, I call it a residence, because it's really a
Mhm.
home where we've taken in by now 14 families, all impoverished with complex trauma. And complex trauma results in dysregulation of behavior and emotion, right? That's a hallmark of complex trauma, occurs in early childhood. And so, given those dynamics, we have taken 14 families and women and we have actually transformed their way of thinking and behaving by addressing the root causes and giving them hope and training and the entire therapeutic framework of reimagining their lives,
Mhm.
out of poverty, because now they have shelter. You give housing and you give them housing security, food security, and then you wrap that around with therapeutic techniques and an entire environment of therapy. You see the transformation in parenting just from mother and child. So both the girls
Absolutely.
who were there are now on honor roll. They were both failing. They were failing and they're now on honor roll. So that's just a lovely, lovely change and transformation to see.
Mhm.
So yes, I totally
Yes,
agree
it
with you. We do have another about 10 minutes. So is there something else you'd like to share?
No, I just wanted to respond to what you were saying. And I think what you're saying, we know is it's the relationship, right? That if you have a relationship with people that have not had support and they've had duress, the relationship is a variable in changing so much of it. The relationship helps people to believe in
Absolutely.
themselves. Because I
And one
would
of the things you
say,
presented was,
no, go,
go ahead.
go ahead. No, 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 you
No,
go
no, no,
ahead.
please go ahead. You were saying,
No, I
okay,
was I
so
was
I was just
just
going to,
going to say you,
the lag
what I
time is
was
so
going to say
helpful, isn't
is
it?
that yes,
But go ahead.
your your the resources that you've provided are essential, but I have to tell you that I don't think it's the resources that make the honor roll. It's the relationship that you have to the individuals that you are supporting in that home. They feel that support, they feel that investment, and they have that relationship with you. And I really believe that that's what makes people feel like they can keep going and doing it. And that's what essentially is broken down in communities like the ones we just saw.
It's such a true statement because honestly, when you work with foster kids like you and I have, the one thing the child always has told me is that When I had someone who believed in me, I changed. As young adults, that's what they've said. I just needed someone to believe in me. And when someone believed in me, I changed. It could have been an aunt, it could have been a foster parent, a grandparent, even a school teacher. You know, it could be, these are such critical adults in your life. And when they believe in you, these kids change. So how do we, I guess, take that from a microcosm of a house situation to the larger community intersectional environment? So that's the transition both ways. It goes from the community to the house, but also from the house to the community. So that's an intersection that we need to bridge. How do we do that?
Well, in the video for the, Chicago showing the blight video, that is actually a documentary that toward the end addresses one particular young man and his family, his mother, and he is also a father. And it shows a group of men, a pastor, someone who's an ex-gang member, investing in a bunch of young men and providing them with opportunity and really essentially fathering. And this is existing now here. And the more that a community has safety, people can come down, they can go outside, they can talk to each other. They're not hungry, they're not wondering where, they're going to get their meal or their shelter, but they have the ability to relate in a safe environment. I think people naturally come together in ways that provide different elements of supportive relationships. It's sort of like I'm downstairs and I see my mail person come in, and I know a little bit about her life because she brings my mail. I get to know her, we talk, and then I want to make her cookies or I want to do something and she wants to do something back. And people relate in communities, and you can't in a fragmented community. And so the South Side, the West Side, there are so many groups that are doing such good work, but there is so much destruction. And one of the policies that happened when they put up the public housing was there was a rule that you couldn't get money if there was a man living in the unit. So they separated fathers and they left mothers alone because fathers meant they didn't have to bring resources to the mother. What happened was then the community and the family broke down and the support broke down. So you have to change some of the policies, and you can't have a policy that says you can't have a Section 8 voucher if you're married. You can't have certain policies in place, or they actually do the opposite of what your goal is, which is give support and allow people to be in an area where they can feel like they can develop community. And then those people, these boys now that are in these terrible traumatic gang situations, they grew up without fathers. They grew up without leaders. They grew up without money. They grew up without resources. They grew up in areas where drugs being dealt, that's the business of the land. So these are the kind of things you have to change so that you have whole families together. And I do think that there are many good programs, but they can't exist on islands in isolation in communities that are so dangerous and so full of poverty.
Absolutely, absolutely. It's one thing when we used to talk about transporting people with substance addictions from one state to another state. And my argument always has been take them to another state, they'll find the same group. So unless we actually change the way people think and process information, we're not going to be able to change the family system per se. So that's a very critical issue. Thank you for your time, Jane. I think Jenny has some housekeeping items that she needs to speak about related to the evaluation in CE. So Jenny, please go ahead.
Yes, thank you. Thank you both for that excellent conversation. For those of you who want CE credit, please click on the link now appearing in the presentation window. This will open the program evaluation. After you submit the evaluation, the attendance confirmation form and request for CLE credit will appear. Please complete the information requested on the form and submit. Your information will be verified, and if your attendance meets all the requirements for CE credit, your certificate will be emailed to you. If you experience any trouble submitting your evaluation and plan on attending the next session, please go ahead and sign in to the next session. If your evaluation is not submitted, you will receive an email from registration@beaconlive.com tomorrow with the evaluation to complete and submit. Thank you again for attending today's program. Goodbye.